All right, so let's keep going. Let's talk about risks. And so we talked a little bit about it earlier about risk management, and we presented the idea that any project we need to know that we need to do a risk assessment, right? And see how that would impact negatively the project, and that there might be several strategies that we might use to mitigate those risks, right? Whether we want to totally avoid them, or are we just going to deal with it when they show up, right? Are we going to transfer that risk to somebody else? Either perhaps we can just take an insurance, right? If that happens, then the insurance will pay us, right? Or perhaps we might share it and transfer that risk to somebody else, maybe the vendor, and says, well, if this fails, you're paying for this, right? And just transfer that to someone else. But if we decide to do something about it, and nobody knows about MySQL, nobody knows about this new sexy technology. And so we're going to go do training and whatnot. We need to assess what is the impact of dealing with it, right? And what costs are associated with dealing with those kinds of risks. If we're going to mitigate it, how much money are we willing to spend to mitigate these risks? And it's important to know this because there'll be multiple alternatives that the business analysts are going to provide us. It says, well, we could do this, we could do that, right? And we like to be able to compare them fairly, right? And so I don't want to paint a rosy picture on one particular alternative if it's not considering several other factors like the risks, right? How much would it cost to have that rosy go down that rosy path, right? So I need to be able to calculate what are the how much money would it be to mitigate these risks, so that I can fairly compare all the different alternatives. Okay. So as we mentioned earlier, the risks are just things that could go wrong, right? Uncertain events. And we mentioned that we wanted to measure them. Both two things, right? We want to measure what were the likelihood of these events occurring, and if they did occur, what would actually be their impact. Right? And we want to be able to create kind of like a matrix, and where you have all the possibilities of probability of occurring and what the impact might be, and then assigning any one R risk, where would it fall in this matrix, right? And then using this matrix for, if we see a lot of them falling in one particular aspect in the matrix, kind of scaring it off and saying, well, maybe we shouldn't go down that way, right? So it's useful for making decisions on which way we want to go. Right? So definitely, we want to be as forthcoming to the business. What are you putting your money here for, right? What are the risks, and go in with open eyes. So we need to create a risk assessment statement that state what the various conditions are and what the possible consequences might be. So here's just a couple of them that. It might be that we have the consulting partner or the design firm that we're choosing. They might have, hopefully we've done our homework. We've talked to previous folks that have worked with this design firm, right? And we are considering 3 or 4 different design firms, and we've talked to prior clients, and we're looking at what the risk might be of using this consulting firm. It has a history of changing their resources. They have and the consequences might be that depending on this, that there may be a learning time, or that the stakeholders are decided that they're not going to be available right? So that's certainly it's a risk factor, right? If I have a question and I don't understand something that I need to implement, if they're not available, how am I going to go forward, right? That's going to push the project release, right? Ideally, in your team, you want to have some folks that are well versed with some finances, how money actually works, some risk management principles, some financial know-how that understands the business, how that has a little bit of insight on how the organization in general, how is it ready to take on these risks, or on whether how adverse to risk are they, right? How willing are they to take on it? Because going from a particular state, from a particular whatever your business is doing, and whatever project that you're going to take on, certainly is going to have any risk, right? And you want to be able to say, well, how willing are you to take this risk? What is the perceived risks and what are the actual risks, and whether you're going to actually jump into this, right? So we want to measure your what we call risk tolerance, right? How willing are you based on these measurements of risk? Certainly you'll have to risk something, right? And so this is the actual amount of risk that you have to take to achieve your goal. Is that risk more or less than what you're willing to take? It could be that it's not risky at all, right? Or it could be that maybe from your point of view it's very risky, right? Perhaps the folks from other points of view, perhaps it's not as risky. It says, it's not too bad, but it could be very, very subjective, right? On from the point of view of the business, how much they're willing to take risks, right? Some of the common risks, and some of these fall into a category of risks that we'll take a look at a little later. Certainly the requirements could be uncertain, or it could be just growing as you go. That you got into it having a preconception that of what you were going to build was actually simpler than what it was, and you're unwilling to say no to the or manage the risk of change, ever-changing requirements, and just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Inadequate communication, that folks are traveling all the time, they're unavailable, the stakeholders don't have a commitment, that indeed the software stack that you chose was the appropriate one for meeting the actual needs of the business. That could be that it meets them today, but it's it was a legacy technology stack that you chose that actually doesn't play well with the upcoming best practices in the industry, that you're not well suited for changes in the future. Whatever you chose today, it's actually or either the development strategy that you're choosing is actually not conducive to easily modifying the source code, and not easily to be maintained. There might be some legacy fiefdoms between the contractors and the clients, or even within the organization. There might be some folks that feel threatened by some of these changes, and they might be holding on to their way of thinking. And certainly there's going to be disruption, right? You are going to be in there, stealing time from folks that are actually running the business from day to day, right? So there's a couple of steps that we might want to follow to deal with risk. First, we'll need to identify what the actual risks are. We'll need to document them. Somebody's going to be responsible to create a matrix of all these risks and what the probabilities are, what their impacts are, and document them. Determine what their the probability of actually of this each one of these what they're happening, what their actual impact might be. Calculate a score and create a matrix of all these probable risks and their probabilities and impacts. calculate, if this happens, what will be the impact into your project, and then decide what are you going to do something about it? Are you going to choose a strategy to deal with that particular risk? But before you even start this, right? What is the cost of dealing with it, right? If we need to retrain our team, do we need to bring folks in and explain to us how certain things work? And that needs to be put into, right, and the overall cost of the project, right? And that so that we can compare the different alternatives fairly with one another, right? So that one might be a little bit too rosy up until you take into account all the various costs. So some of the risk areas that we mentioned earlier. Again, I believe the tech folks, the geeky folks are somewhat responsible for this, right? That we're always pushing for the latest and greatest. Oftentimes pushing technology that it's unproven, that nobody actually has a system running on production that is using that technology, right? But nevertheless, as geeks, we oftentimes we want to maintain our skills sharpened, and we're always pushing for the latest and greatest. But perhaps it's not what we need for our particular solution. Right, the scope might be ambiguous. The project horizon might be way ahead, way out there, and there's no way to be certain of anything with such a far out project horizon. The lack of stakeholder commitment, we mentioned that, right? The resources, we might have either financial or technology or people resources that we might need. We might be dealing with multiple vendors that we are dependent on, right? On their so there's certainly their risk, and we haven't decided on how is it that we're going to deliver the process and manage any changes. Oftentimes we don't decide early on how is that we're going to measure progress, right? That how far are we? We're very, very, very common that we say we were 90% done, but the last 10% we take forever. That's very common that we don't have a clear, objective measure on what do we mean by done. That there's we don't agree how is that we're going to measure or monitor our progress. Also, we're not sure of the sensitivity of different events occurring on what the impact actually might be from a particular event occurring. Business process might change, and there might be several legal regulations that might be coming that might affect us negatively. So as a business analyst, you'll be responsible for cataloging all these risks, right? For each one, you'll be given a name, a unique identifier, and describing what the probability might be of this happening, what the impact might be, calculating a score, right? Trying to rank it, right? And see, this would be a relative ranking, right? On how the risks rank against each other. Certainly very subjective, right? But nonetheless is a way of measuring them, right? And also, what's going to be your strategy to respond to them, whether you actually mitigate them or just accept it and deal with it when it comes. There'll be an assigned responsible, right? Of who do you go to more about that risk. Kind of calculate what if you've chosen to mitigate, right, that risk. Well, how much does it cost to mitigate it, right? Do we need to retrain? Do we need to change the infrastructure? What is the cost so that we can calculate what and better measure this risk against other risks, right? So that we can compare apples to apples. So assessing the probability. We mentioned earlier that we will have some some measure of percentage-wise, what is the probability of actually happening? Is it a 90% very likely, or is it very unlikely, 10%, and anything in between? And again, this is very subjective, and you'll have multiple folks telling you multiple different things. Right? Some folks will say, no, it's very unlikely. Other folks telling you definitely unlikely. And this will come out very early on. Some folks will be biased one way, so ideally you want this to run several of these voting sessions over time. And ideally what you would see is that everybody will be somewhere in the mean, right? There'll be some standard deviation, folks that are outliers, right? That eventually after multiple votes, right, they all come together and towards one consensus. And also the measurement of the impact on, say, whether it's very low, moderate, high, very high, again, very subjective. On what do you think the impact might be? Will it increase 10 to 20% the cost or the time in the overall project, 20 or 40 or more than 40%? And again, these thresholds, will be decided as a group. What do you consider to be these thresholds, right? And then we can then score them by just multiplying the probabilities, both probabilities of the impact and occurrence, and then we can scale it. We can scale any which way we want. But multiplying by 10, gives you a nice number between 0 and 100 that we can then use it as a ranking, relative ranking across multiple risks. The response, as we mentioned earlier, either avoid, meaning you're going to make every effort that this will never occur, right? And although the cost of avoiding this might be prohibitive, right? It says, well, no, we're going to be here. The whole project will be just trying to avoid this ever happening, right? So it might be that it's not realistic, right, to completely avoid it. Or I might say that maybe I get an insurance policy. Right? If it does occur, I'll be compensated of any losses that might occur. Or by contractual obligation, I'll give it out to the vendor, or somebody else will be responsible for the losses that I incur. Or somehow I mitigated. There'll be a cost on how to deal with this, either retraining or establishing a brand new infrastructure, or to increase the unlikelihood of happening. So I could not just avoid it, but maybe I could reduce it somehow, right? By making it redundant, by having backups and whatnot, and just mitigating and making the impact lower, right? Or I can just accept it and says, okay, well, it'll happen. I can't do anything. I'll just deal with it when it does happen. So this gives us kind of like a map, a heat map on the all possible scores that we can paint it with our own colors, and it kind of gives us all these risks. Where do they fall? Where do they fall in this heat map? Are they all concentrated over here? Are we somewhere in between, or some way out there, right? And gives us kind of a confidence on how on how we measure ourselves as our risk tolerance, right? In this heat map, where are they falling? All of these. So common responses to different risk features. So it might be a new technology. If we feel not confident enough for a particular technology, we might want to prototype. We want to make sure that folks understand what this are. Enough to give us some confidence that yes, we can deal with it. Right? We don't know much, but at least we've prototyped enough that we're okay with going ahead with a particular technology. There might be some safety hazards. Some team members might have a safety plan to avoid, and maybe a protocol, and having two folks going in together so that if somebody faints, somebody's there to help them out. So there might be some protocols and that safety plans put in place. So there may be a very complex architecture. We might decide to kind of modularize it so that we can deal with the difficulties and complexities of the architecture in an iterative fashion. There might be some new hardware that we might formal model it to simulate how it's going to behave once it's deployed and ready to go. So for each one of them, whatever choice you make on whether you're avoiding it or you're going to mitigate it, there's always going to be a cost to your choice on how to deal with it. And so to make the multiple alternatives that you can compare them, apples to apples, we need to calculate the cost and then do a fair comparison and add it to the cost so that we can compare side by side. So that we're not skewing the one of the choices over another, right? So the cost, whatever the cost you think is gonna be, and then the probability of after mitigation. So presumably, if you're gonna mitigate it, right? It says, okay, well, I prototyped it. I train my folks, and that's what's going to cost me. Presumably, your probability will go down. It says, well, this is not going to happen. Now that everybody's trained and I have a brand new infrastructure and I've dealt with it, what presumably the probability will go down, right? Of the risk going down. So I have a probability of happening before and a probability of happening afterwards, after I've dealt with it, and what the impact will be afterwards. Once I have all these costs dealt with, I'm gonna for every risk that I've dealt with it and have a particular strategy, I have a total cost, right? That's it's still there, right? I need to add it to the overall project to be able to compare. Now, each one of these each one of these costs perhaps is spread over multiple projects, because there might be multiple teams, right, that might be dealing with different aspects of the product, and they all need to be considered in tandem. Okay. All right.